It says you're live streaming, and I just admitted everybody.
Okay.
Yep, you're live. You're good.
Okay. Well, let me start recording. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and welcome everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started. I've got a minute after noon, so we'll let people in as they join in, but just welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm Zach Myers, Risk Education Manager for the Center for Dairy Excellence, and co-hosting the webinar with me today is Dr. Veronica Velena with Penn State's Mill College of Business. Our goal today is to provide you with a summary of the results of the survey sent out last summer and to provide you the opportunity to ask us questions about that survey and hopefully to provide Veronica and I a better understanding of where everyone is joining us from today and what your affiliation is. I've got a quick poll that I would like to put up. And so as you're answering that poll, I'll just go over a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. If at any time you have questions, you may type them into the chat box. And to make sure we stay on time, we will hold all the questions until the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are joining us through the live stream on Facebook or YouTube, we are monitoring those feeds as well. So if you have questions, you can submit your questions through either one of those platforms as well. And we'll, in the time permitting, we'll try to get everything. We'll try to get everything answered. So I'll end polling and share the results. Looks like most of us, of course, are in Pennsylvania, and we have a few people from out of state, which is great. I know there's people out of state that do work in Pennsylvania as well, and looks like the majority of the folks joining us today are either in academia or university extension, but we have a good percent of dairy farmers as well. So again, thank you for being on, and we'll at this point we'll just we'll jump right in. So. A little bit about the survey, but first, a special thank you to the 711 farmers that completed the survey. This was a lengthy survey with a lot of information and questions to answer, and we appreciate all of you taking the time to provide us with the information that you've given us and allowing us to have a decent data set to look at numbers on. So. The survey was designed by several of us here at the center in collaboration with Dr. Veronica Velena. And there's 27 questions, and I sort of grouped the questions into 4 different main categories that include owner and herd demographics, financial impacts of COVID, farm practices and improvements made and planned to be made. And then there were a few questions related to cooperatives and milk handlers at the end. The survey was mailed to over 5,000 current and former Pennsylvania dairy farmers last June. And again, 711 completed surveys were returned to us. 588 of those are still active, with 123 of those having exited the dairy business at some point prior to the survey. Completed surveys from active dairies represented 55 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. Lancaster County had the most surveys sent in with 142. And if you include the top 10 counties with the most responses, those top 10 counties represented 60% of the responses received. The survey responses, according to cow numbers reported in the survey, represented almost 80,000 of Pennsylvania's 482,000 head of dairy cows, which is about 17%. So there's actually a little fewer cows now, I think, than that, but 482,000 is the number of cows during the time period that includes the survey responses. So herd sizes ranged from 4 cows to up to 3,000, and so these herd sizes were divided into the 4 categories you see there, along with the distribution of how many numbers in the percent were in those 4 categories. So today's webinar will include a look at what's in the survey. I will spend the first 30 minutes going through sort of averages and numbers and different things, what's in the survey, and then Veronica will go over some interactions and different things that she saw in her analysis. She did more statistical analysis, whereas I just sort of put the numbers together and looked at averages and stuff. So moving into the primary owner and herd demographics, 95% of the survey responses indicated that the primary owner is male, whereas 5% were female. The distribution was 504 males to 5 females. You can see how that breaks down in the table there. By herd size, average age was 54 years, with males being slightly younger than females. Another question asked was what business structure their dairy had. 544 of the active dairies answered this question, with sole proprietors being the most common business structure, with 70% of those 544 saying they had a sole proprietorship. 15 partnerships made up 15%. Limited liability companies made up 8%, and then the different types of corporations were 3%. Less than 3% said they were self-employed, and then there was a couple of responses that didn't fit into either any of the classifications you see there. So moving into herd demographics, the average herd size for this data set was 137 cows per dairy, producing about 65.8 pounds per cow, or 20,068 pounds per cow per year, based on a 305 day lactation. Production numbers were reported during June and July, and this is just a snapshot of 1 day's production. So these numbers, I didn't adjust this for seasonality, so the numbers are just based on that 1 daily production. So just as a note, so you know how that number is calculated, it's not adjusted for seasonality, so may not be. It's only an estimate, not necessarily exact. So based on 2019 production records, the average Pennsylvania cow produces about 20,629 pounds per year. So the participants in this survey are slightly under that average. Looking at this data set, there's nearly a 20 pound per cow difference in production between the smallest herd size and the largest. Each dairy in the survey averaged having about 107 heifers, which equates to a heifer to cow ratio of nearly 8/10, or nearly 1 replacement for each cow. So the old rule of thumb is to have a replacement for each mature cow, but in today's dairy market, that's not necessarily a good rule of thumb, with the expense of raising heifers. And if you have extra heifers, you may overcrowd your system, or if you have to sell them, then you won't necessarily be able to recoup the cost of raising her when you sell her at market price. So only one milk quality question was asked, and I'm encouraged by the responses. 95% of the surveys reporting somatic cell counts reported having less than 250,000. Of course, mastitis research indicates that when somatic cell count exceeds 200,000, then some level of mammary infection exists. And milk production losses can occur even though a cow may not show any clinical signs of infection. According to DHIA records that I monitor, Pennsylvania average somatic cell count has been decreasing year over year for at least the last 5 years, if not longer. And only 5% of the surveys recorded having an average somatic cell count of over 250,000. And of course, milk marketers and cooperatives use somewhere in the 200 to 250 range as a cutoff for incentives. And if you get over that incentive cutoff, then there's a free space. But then if you get higher than that, then you risk, or the dairy farmer risks having to pay a milk quality penalty rather than getting the premium. A few financial questions were asked. Survey responses said that 85% of the total income on the dairy does come from milk sales. And then smaller amounts of income come from beef or veal. Crops made up 5%. The other category, 4%, that some responses were like fruit crops or vegetable crops that are sold. Also, off-farm income would be included here as well. And then genetics was the smallest portion, with only 1% of the survey saying they get income from that source. So 147 dairies reported that they calculate their cost of production, while 363, or 71% of respondents, said they did not. This result really wasn't surprising to me, but it is discouraging that so many Pennsylvania dairy farmers do not know their cost of production. Of course, the first step to being able to manage cost is to understanding what they are. So it's difficult to have a successful risk management plan without knowing what milk price you need to at least break even. So they are the folks that answered yes were also asked to provide cost of production. 121 dairy farms reported their cost of production. Of course, this is not a very good sample size, not a large sample size. So, but there was enough information to generate data and averages at least for the data set. But these averages are provided for your information only. They're certainly, the data set's certainly not big enough to make any inferences on cost of production for these herd sizes across the state. So the overall average cost of production in this data set was $16.94. The highest cost of production was in the 200 plus cow category at nearly $18. And then the smallest average for the data set was in the 50 to 99 cow range at $15.67. Average feed cost was another question asked. And again, not many people answered this question. So like cost of production, these numbers certainly shouldn't be used to make any generalizations about Pennsylvania feed cost, but it does tell you, it is informative, at least for this data set. So the overall average feed cost was $7.85, with the smallest, or the cheapest feed cost being in the 200 plus cow range, and the most expensive in the less than 50 cow range, which again, this isn't a large data set, but it does indicate that with economies of scale, the larger dairy farms may be able to have a cheaper feed cost than a smaller operation. But again, these numbers shouldn't be used to make inferences about the Pennsylvania feed cost. Moving on to impact of COVID-19. One of the questions asked as a result of the market disruption of COVID-19, do you expect to go out of business in the next 3 to 6 months? So luckily, 96% of those dairies answering the question indicated that they plan to still continue milking cows. However, there were 22 dairies that indicated that they were at least somewhat likely to exit the dairy business as a result of the impacts of the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, as you can see on the right graph, the most common answer was the most likely reason was economics. So anytime there's extremely volatile markets, that of course puts a lot of stress on that bottom line. The next question asked about dumped milk. When asked if they had dumped any milk in March, April, or May, 60 dairies indicated that they had to dump some milk. And as you might expect, larger dairies had to dump a larger volume of milk. The 7 dairies in the 200 plus category that reported dumping milk dumped over 154,000 pounds of milk per dairy during that time frame. And And if you combine all the three smaller herd sizes, the largest herd size still had to dump 158,000 pounds more than those other three combined. But if you look at it on a percentage basis, the percent show that the 100 to 199 category had to dump the largest percentage of their milk, followed by the smallest group of 50, and then 50, 99, and finally 200 plus. So even though the 200 plus had the largest volume, the actual percentage of production less was the lowest of the four herd sizes. And then looking at the graph on the right, the largest percentage of milk dumping of milk was in April. And if you'll remember, that was the height of getting supply chains reconfigured or retooled to meet shifting demands from half of the dairy sales from food service to more on the retail side in grocery stores. So the next question was if they had to dump milk, had they received any compensation for that dumped milk, and then only 22 of the 60 dairies that reported dumped milk had received any compensation. So again, this was sort of early in the pandemic, and not as much money was available. However, CFAP, the initial round of CFAP payments applications were being received and made at this time. So, and then of course here in Pennsylvania, we had the Dairy Cares program that used state coronavirus monies to compensate for some of that, but dumped milk, but that didn't. The actual applications were being received, but payments weren't made until September or so on that. So none of that money was available. So based on the compensation that was available, the CFAP 1 payments, dairy farmers were asked how to rank the importance of those payments on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 not being important and 5 being very important. Overall, most dairies found CFAP payments very important. However, there were certainly differences among herd sizes. 29% of the smallest dairies category ranked CFAP payments as not important, compared to 21% for the next size up, 16% for 100 to 199, and then only 4% of the 200 plus cow categories ranked CFAP payments as not important. So how much during the pandemic, how much was requested by milk handlers or cooperatives to reduce milk? So 17, according to the respondents' answers in the survey, 17 cooperatives or milk handlers requested their customers to reduce production. The most common request was for 15% reduction. But if you average the results of the whole data set, it was slightly less at 14%. But 5 cooperatives or milk handlers accounted for 90% of the reductions requests. So there were those 5 cooperatives that had a lot of responses, and a lot of those responses indicated that they were asked to reduce their milk supply. So moving on to some improvements that are made or planned to be made. So this just want to point out on this slide that there has been quite a few improvements made over the last 5 years, and quite a few planned for the next 5 years. So if you'll look at that graph, it shows that cow comfort, housing facilities, feed handling systems all had the most responses. And if you look for changes made in the last 5 years, and the plan changes basically mirrors that as well. So a lot of folks looking to improve cow comfort, or which housing facilities can go with that, and improving their feed handling systems. And of course, milking systems and manure handling systems weren't very far behind that as well. So according to these results, 1,214 changes were made over the last 5 years, and 960 changes are planned for the next 5 years. So this averages out to across all the dairies, active dairies in this data set, 2.1 changes were made per dairy, with an additional 1.6 changes planned for the next year. So what that tells me is that Pennsylvania dairy farms are trying to keep, despite depressed milk prices for a long time, are trying to keep up with their, making improvements as they need to, and keeping their operation up to date and running as smoothly as possible. So the next group of questions involved using consultants, risk management, and conservation practices. Just a couple of things to note from this graph. Most dairies have used financial and nutrition consultants and have some form of erosion control or no-till farming practices. However, as you can see from the bars representing the different herd sizes, smaller dairies were less likely to have used this practice compared to larger farmers. But the most important thing, at least to me, and the most concerning thing to me, is the graph of overall lack of the use of crop insurance or milk price risk management. Both of these practices can be key to mitigating market volatility, like we've seen over 2020. And herd size trends are definitely evident here as well, with fewer smaller dairies utilizing these practices compared to larger dairies. So why is that? We as an industry maybe need to try to answer that question and see why more dairy farms aren't using these practices, and why are smaller dairies more likely not to use them than larger dairies. Because we could certainly help our industry by helping these dairies with helping mitigate market volatility. So on the next two slides, I'd like to look at the importance of 8 different factors listed in the survey to the performance of individual dairies. You'll see that all milk yield and cost and milk price related factors ranked high. Note on this slide that 91% of dairy farmers rank decreasing cost of production as somewhat or very important. This contradicts early information provided where only 29% actually calculate the cost of production. So why is this? But what this says to me is that dairy farmers understand the importance of knowing cost of production, but for whatever the reason, they don't calculate it. Maybe they don't know how to. Maybe someone hasn't offered to help them do it, or perhaps they don't think they have the time to worry with it. So, but that tells me there's a great opportunity that exists for those of us in the dairy support industry to help more dairy farmers understand the importance of cost of production and help them get that calculated so that they can manage that cost of production. And if decreasing cost of production is important, then they have to know it in order to see if there's room for improvement. So the only factor that did not rank very important was increasing herd size. 71% of survey responses said that increasing herd size was not important to them. However, there were differences by herd size. 40% of the dairies in the 200 plus cows category ranked increasing herd size as somewhat or very important, compared to considerably less for the other 3 smaller herd sizes. So the next couple of slides will go over the importance factors that needed for dairy operations. The responses to each factor varied, but trends definitely existed by herd size. For instance, labor availability and computerized systems on this slide show that the majority of small farms rank them as not important compared to their larger counterparts, which really makes sense, especially from a labor standpoint. Smaller farms can't support numerous employees, and most of work is done by the owner and his or her family. So labor availability might not necessarily be as important. And with fewer cows, keeping health records or whatever on paper is although difficult, is still in some cases feasible. On this slide, larger dairies were more likely to rank the use of outside advisors and land availability more important compared to smaller dairies. The only factor of the 7 that smaller dairies ranked more important than larger dairies was milk hauling services. So why is this? Perhaps it's on a percent basis, it's more expensive, and the freight's more expensive for smaller farms to be picked up and are charged a higher percent than maybe a producer that's shipping a load a day. It's hauling rates are a little different. So or perhaps there's other issues that I'm unaware of, or that would be more important to smaller dairies from a milk hauling standpoint than larger dairies. So the last few slides are some questions we asked about cooperatives and the result and milk handlers. One question was asked if for dairy farmers to indicate what cooperative they belong to and if they participate in the farm program, the Farmers Assuring Responsible Management Program, a national program that's supported by National Milk, IDFA, Dairy Checkoff, and of course a lot of the consumers across the country that are looking into animal welfare programs. This is a program that right now, according to National Milk, covers 99% of the milk production in the United States. So it's not surprising that 80% of the dairy farmers responding to this survey said that they did participate in the farm program. So the one thing that was sort of intriguing and sort of confused me is and indicates that maybe there's some kind of breakdown in communication, is that actually of dairies that reported farm participation, of course, some of those, we know that some of those milk handlers and co-ops require participation in farm program to sell, for them to be able to market the dairy farmers' milk. So based on my analysis of the co-ops and milk marketers that were indicated in the survey, 15% of respondents that belong to co-ops or milk handlers, marketers that I know require participation in farm program, 15% of those people said that they do not. So there is an opportunity to figure out why, even though they do participate in the farm program, if they're members of these co-ops, why do they answer that they're not? So is there a breakdown in communication? Do they not understand what the program is? So that is an opportunity for cooperatives or milk handlers to reach out and do some more education around the farm program. And on my last slide before I turn it over to Veronica is the results of the dairy farmers were asked to rank the degree to which they agree or disagree with those three statements you see there. This cooperative milk handler has always been even-handed in its negotiations with your farm. You trust this cooperative or milk handler treats you fairly, and you are concerned that this cooperative or milk handler may use opportunities that arise to profit at your expense. So the overwhelming overall responses to these three questions were neutral to positive. However, some negative responses show that there is opportunity that exists for improved relationships among cooperatives and milk handlers with their dairy farmer members or customers. So granted, these rankings are subjective or individual perceptions, which does not necessarily equate to reality. However, an individual's perception is their reality. If any cooperative or milk handler participating today or listens to the recording in the future, I would like to see that data specific to your company, please contact me and I'd be happy to provide you with that specific information. So with that, that's all I have. And so I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Veronica. And Veronica, if you would take a minute or two, give us, the participants, a little bit of a background of who you are and where you, what your analysis or area of expertise is. I can't hear you.
I was muted.
There we go.
So thank you, Zach. My name is Veronica Velena. I am assistant professor of supply chain management in the business school at Penn State University. My research focuses on sustainability and how we can help supply chains to become more sustainable. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, here. Okay. So one of the main goals of working with CDE was to understand how can we help farmers, Pennsylvania farmers, to be more resilient over time. So what we did is first let's have an analysis. What is the I would say the real picture right now? So in the survey, we asked farmers to indicate whether they are no longer in business. As Zach mentioned before, we have 123 farmers that says we are no longer in business. Out of these 123 farmers, some of them, actually 30 of them, responded to who was their cooperatives. So you see here is a set of cooperatives are the ones that capture, some of the farmers who are no longer in business. Also, it's very important to mention that some of these, especially the top two co-ops here, are the ones who have the largest portion of farmers in Pennsylvania. Another characteristic that I was very interested to see is who are the ones who are leaving, right? So are they large farmers or are they small farmers? Clearly, the data shows here that 80% of the farmers who have left business are, farmers who have less than 200 cows. Right? So this is not new information. I'm sure that most of you know that are the smaller farmers, the ones who are exiting the market. But the fact that we can quantify this is very important for us as part of our research. The other component that I want to talk, let me see if I can do this. So who else are the ones who are leaving the market? So we actually look at if our female operators or male operators are the ones leaving. And you can see here that the percentage is very even, right? 50% of the farmers who are leaving are, are female, and the same for male. The big difference here is, as Zach mentioned before, there are a very small percentage of women operators in farming. However, 50% of the time, they are the ones who are exiting the market. The other component that I wanted to share with you is because we did this study during the pandemic, so we wanted to know whether it was safe for farmers. We asked in the survey the question that, has anyone working on the farm become sick with COVID-19? You see here the graph over here, if you see my cursor, almost 74% indicated that they did not have anyone in the farm, with COVID-19. And we have only 8%, 8.6% of the farmers indicated that they have a confirmed case in the farm. We have 17% of the farmers telling us that they do not know. So that means that the farm workers may have, some symptoms, but they were not tested. So overall, I would say almost 75% of the farmers says that we didn't have any kind of positive COVID-19 case in the farm. The second question that we asked was, because of COVID-19, have you implemented any emergency plan? And this is something here that you see in the sample, that 82% of the farmers told us that they did not have any kind of emergency plan in place. There was only a very small percentage of farmers who indicated, 18% to be precise, who indicated that they had in place an emergency plan. So we are thinking, the way how we are thinking is, well, there are a set of farmers who are leaving the market. Now COVID-19 hit, right? Situation is getting even worse. And on top of all of these situations, we know that there is some demands. I wouldn't say even new demands, but probably in the last 4 or 5 years, it has been becoming even more important, more vocal. I'm thinking about, for example, the demand for implementing more conservative practices, conservation practices, sorry. So I actually visited many of, I believe 10 farmers here in Pennsylvania and have very long conversations. And they were telling me that some of you actually, because you are a large farmer, you are kind of targeted by, animal rights advocates. So this is coming, is becoming more and more important. I would say from the consumer perspective, right? And the consumers kind of put pressure on the brands. I'm talking about, for example, here Nestle, and that the brands are working now with the co-ops and the farmers to address this kind of incidents regarding animal welfare. There is another expectations, and this is something that I've been following, and that doesn't happen only here in Pennsylvania, by the way. This is also a situation in New York, and where we have more advocacy groups, asking for better working conditions for farm workers. And again, these advocacy groups are putting pressure on the brands, and the brands on the co-ops, and co-ops on the farmers. So these are kind of, I would say, more and becoming more salient, these demands over time. So this is the picture that we have. We have a number of farmers leaving or exiting the market. We have COVID-19 situation, and then around this, we also have these new expectations. So it seems to me like the key question here is, how do we help farmers, Pennsylvania farmers, to become more resilient? And what is resilience, Veronica? Right. So here is something that we have been thinking about it in the study that I'm conducting. And I want everybody to be on the same page when I say the word resilience. Is the farmer's ability to cope with a drastic change brought by a major disruption like COVID-19, respond to it, and restore operations. So, so this is one of the studies that I'm conducting, is how do we help Pennsylvania farmers to become more resilient? And in my research, I found one report. This study was conducted 4 months before COVID-19 hit. And there are two authors in this study. And what they actually argue is that those farmers who implement conservation practices are going to become more resilient over time, even during this kind of, very uncertain situation. For the farming industry in the last few years, it has been a really tough years for many of you. So this study, what they did is they invited 4 Pennsylvania farmers to be part of this study. And they help these Pennsylvania farmers to do their conservation practices and follow up with them. And what were the cost savings that the farmers have as a result of implementing these conservation practices? Most of these farmers, for example, I have a chance to read the report. Most of the farmers says, look, because of these conservation practices, I have more healthy soil. And healthy soil leads to better yield, right? You have a better yield, and then so you reduce costs because you have you spend less money in purchasing feed, right? So this is a very interesting study, and I wanted to share with you one quote that I found really fascinating, and I fully agree with this. Many of you knows Alan Novak. He is the executive director of PDMP. And this is what he said. We have long believed that for some dairy farmers in Pennsylvania, the investments of limited funds for conservation is perceived as nothing more than an expense that they cannot afford. Hopefully, they can see from their peers and neighbors presented in this study that conservation practices may actually help their bottom line in the long term, and that they will be more inclined to invest in that. Again, this study was focusing only on 4 dairy farmers here in Pennsylvania from different sizes. I remember one of the farmers being having 50 cows versus another farmer having 2,000 cows. So it's really fascinating to see the point that he's making here that, the investments that we do in conservation practices will have an impact on the bottom line. Similar to this study, what I did was, okay, if we have this study only focusing on 4 farmers, I was thinking, is it true if we look at a large sample of Pennsylvania farmers? And this is what I'm testing now. So what we did first, we investigated 3 sustainable practices. We look at the environmental and conservation practices that we asked in the survey. You see here that we have renewable energy, energy conservation practices, aerobic digester, runoff, no-till, and any other environmental improvement. So when I look at, we ask the farmers whether they have made investments in any of these conservation practices in the last 5 years. The results are very, I would say, very encouraging. You see here, 23 farmers indicated that they have 4 practices. So all of them here, right? We have 83 farmers telling us that we at least have 3 of these practices in place. If we look at this, almost 20% of our sample are telling us that Pennsylvania farmers at least have 3 or 4 of these environmental conservation practices motion. So, which is really very encouraging news. On the other side, we have, for example, still 17% of the farmers who do not have any kind of conservation practices. This is an opportunity, obviously. One of the things that I have learned by interviewing many of the farmers is, you cannot do it alone. Clearly, you need kind of educational support, in some cases, financial support, obviously. So this is an opportunity still for the support centers to help Pennsylvania farmers to do more in conservation practices. The other group that I looked at was the labor practices. During my interviews to some of the farmers, you were sharing with me the fact that it's very hard to retain your farm workers. It's very hard, Veronica, to actually find very reliable farm workers, right? So in the middle of this situation, well, there are some basic human resource practices that farmers can use. And these are the questions that we ask. One of these basic human resource practices, how often do you interact with your farm workers? So this is what we, here the data is telling us from this sample is less encouraging, I will say. Only 5% of the farmers told us that they communicate with their farm workers in a daily basis. Only 5%. We also asked the question whether the farm's owners conduct an annual performance review to their personnel. As you see here, the numbers, only 9% of the farmers indicated that they do a very informal annual performance review. And the last data point that we have is whether the farmers provide any kind of financial incentives to the farm workers based on the quality of milk. Only 10% of the farmers indicated. We did this analysis. I break down this analysis by whether these farmers are large or small. And really, the pattern is very similar. Even large farmers do not conduct any annual performance review or do not provide incentives to the farm workers. The last practice that we look at is animal welfare practices. So I think I remember Zach mentioning that 80% of the farmers indicated in our sample that they are part of this program. And I understand that any of these practices, environmental, labor, and animal welfare practices, I understand that these require a lot of upfront investments. And in the middle of a pandemic, given the situation that the market, I would say the the milk price has not been great for the last few years. I understand that many of you or many farmers are looking at the short term, but the data is very clear telling us that this is actually the time to still thinking about long-term investments for your farm. I'm going to show you some of the results that I ran the analysis. So clearly, we look at how can what determines what determines a farmer to continue in business, and what determines whether a farmer implement an emergency plan. So we look at these three variables: the environmental practices, the labor practices, and the farm program practices too. And each of them, as you see here, has a positive impact. So let me explain. So the more environmental conservation practices that you implement in your farm in the last 5 years, the more likely that you're going to continue in business, the more likely that your farm is going to implement an emergency plan. So the environmental conservation practices has very strong support. The labor practices have not support for firm continuity, but it has support for those who wants to implement an emergency plan. And finally, the farm program. So for those farmers who have are part of this program, they are more likely to stay on business, and they are more likely to implement an emergency plan. I would say overall, these three practices, the more that you invest on them, the more likely that you are going to be a resilient farmer. And by resiliency, I mean that you can continue in business and you can implement any emergency plan. In this particular case, we collected the data during the COVID-19 pandemic, but even in a future pandemic, these farmers who implement the environmental, labor, and farm practices are more likely to, I would say, navigate any kind of crisis in the future. The other analysis that we conduct is, okay, Veronica, there are any differences between large versus small farmers? Is there any difference if the operator is a female versus a male operator? So here are some of the results that we conducted, and clearly there is a big difference between large versus small farmers, right? So you see, for example, in this graph here, so what we are capturing here is the likelihood to stay in business. You see the red line, which represents the large farmers, have I would say a much steady slope here. So what it means is that those farmers who have implemented the large farmers who have implemented environmental and conservation practices are going to accelerate their likelihood of staying in business compared to the small farmers. The same thing here. Those farmers, here we have the farm program, those farmers who have, large farmers who have the farm program in place are more likely to accelerate to stay in business. So what is telling this two graph is the large farmers benefit more from implementing environmental practices, conservation practices, and even animal welfare practices. So this is good news for large farmers, right? It's not so good news for smaller farmers. So the second comparison that I did is, women versus men operators. And I found it fascinating, these two graphs. What is telling you that, again, the red line is women. You see that the women's operators actually benefit more from implementing the farm program, for example. And when I say benefit more, it means that they are going to stay in business. They are going to implement an emergency plan. Clearly, women farmers are more likely to stay in business if they have in place a farm program. They are more likely to implement an emergency plan if they have implemented the farm program. One thing that I found fascinating is even though women clearly here shows that they will continue on business and they will benefit more, benefit more from these farm program practices. There are, I also learned that a lot of a few of the women's actually operators have very limited access to these kind of, I would say, programs. So this is something to consider as well. And the last slide that I have here is, again, looking at women versus men operators. Clearly, those women operators who implement conservation practices really are benefiting a lot in staying in business and in implementing an emergency plan compared to their male counterparts here. So, so these are some of the results. I have not, I would say, there are many more results that we have conducted, but for this presentation, I just put some of the results that I believe may be interesting for the audience. But I will be happy to answer any question here. So there are some key lessons from what we what we have talked so far. Zach, would you like to go with the first ones?
Sure. A couple that I added here is that the first point, while 91% of dairy farmers rank decreasing cost of production somewhat, are very important. Only 29% actually calculate it. So what can we do to increase the number of dairy farmers that know their cost of production? So that's a question for myself and others in the industry and for the dairy farmers themselves. Why don't we know or help our clients learn what their cost of production is? And then the second one I have is risk management is one way to decrease market volatility, yet it's not widely used, at least as evidence from our data set. So again, another question for us as an industry is how can we increase those numbers? Risk management with the market volatility we saw last year, and it doesn't seem to. Volatility is here. I mean, the only way to mitigate that volatility is with some of these risk management programs that are available now. Today, more than any other time in the past, we have more opportunities or more tools available to us or to you as dairy farmers to mitigate that volatility, and we need to we need to come up with plans. And with that, I think the last two are yours, Veronica.
Thank you, Zach. So as I showed before, investments in conservation, labor, and animal welfare practices increase the likelihood to stay in business, increase the likelihood to implement an emergency plan during a pandemic. I think the results are very clear. Farmers should continue implementing these practices. I understand that some of these practices require, upfront investment, but really, I know that many of you probably are thinking the short term, but what this study is telling us is, the data is telling us is, in fact, you need to start thinking about the long term and start making those investments in conservation, labor, and animal welfare practices. And the last point that I have here is, we have two groups, right? We look at the small farmers, those who are leaving the market. 80% of them in the sample is telling us are small farmers, and we have women operators. So what the data is telling us that we will need some customized programs for these two groups if we would like to support that. And the last data point that I have here is that of the farmers that we have 2/3 of the farmers who indicated that they will discontinue milk production had a herd size of 100 or fewer cows. So this is telling us, when we ask the farmers, how likely you are going to discontinue your milking cows, we see that a large percentage of these farmers are actually small. And also we see that 45% of the time of the farmers who leave businesses or exit the business are actually run by women. So again, these are two vulnerable groups that we need to think about different stakeholders, the support centers. I'm thinking about the co-ops. I'm thinking about even the brands. How can we help these two vulnerable groups, to do better? And with that, I think we are going to open the floor for questions.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. We appreciate working with you on this project, and we appreciate your input and your presentation today as well. And we have one question come in, and Veronica, I thought of one question while you're going through. I'll open with one question for you. You said that only 5% of the dairies communicate on a daily, or owners communicate on a daily basis with their employees. Of course, communication is the key with most anything. And so what advice do you have to those other 95% that say they don't spend any time communicating at least on a daily basis? What advice do you have for them on starting a plan of communicate on a more frequent basis and maybe in a better way?
Great question, Zach. I'm thinking the whole point of improving the communication is to have happy farm workers, right? Workers that are going to stay in your farm, because this is one of the biggest problems that you're facing. There are different ways to, that you can increase the communication. Some of you actually, when I was interviewing, were saying, look, Veronica, what about kind of informal gatherings, right? You organize, during the summer, you invite the farm workers and their families to have a gathering, a social gathering in your farm, and you get to know the farm workers, and you get to know their families. That's one idea. I mean, just think about nothing expensive, by the way. Think about something that you can afford to do, and having a highly engaged farm workers. I have the chance also to interview several farm workers, and it makes a difference for them when they are working for a farm owner that cares about them and cares about their family. So I will invite, I would say, the dairy farmers, think about kind of a very informal gatherings that you can organize along the year, to get to know your workers and their families. Very small things counts a lot on their mind.
Thank you, Veronica. Just I guess a sort of another follow-up on that is you also mentioned incentives, and I know when I managed my family's dairy farm for 16 years, and most of that time we had a somatic cell count incentive, and I had an incentive program with my feed man, but always had issues with incentives. Why should I pay somebody extra why don't they just do their job? So what advice I recognized the value in that incentive, but also had that conflicting mentality. Why don't they just do their job without me having to pay them extra money? What advice do you have someone that might be considering an incentive that has that is trying to jump over that hurdle of not wanting to provide them extra money for doing maybe what's considered to be their job?
Going back to my point, my original point, the idea is to have happy workers, reliable workers, right? Those that you are going to count on them. And given the fact that we are under, the labor, I would say is very, I would say, getting to hire some labor farm workers is actually difficult nowadays. So giving financial incentives gives another boost to farm workers to be happy and to do a better job. Think about, Zach, even as I'm trying to put myself as an example here, right? So if I'm going to do my job, I'm going to do my research, I'm going to teach in the class. But if I have incentives based on how productive I am for my research and how impactful my research is, I'm going to do the extra mile. I'm just not going to do my 40 hours a week, right? I'm going to go even up above, and I'm going to be very happy working for that, in my case, for the Smith College of Business, right? So I think there are different ways to incentivize the farm workers here. And I was kind of surprised to see that only 10% of farm owners in Pennsylvania provide a kind of incentives, right? So in other industries, again, compared to, because that's what I do more in the manufacturing settings, these financial incentives, the proportion are much, much higher, right? So this is another opportunity. But Zach, I'm gonna say here, I think there is a huge opportunity. And I'm thinking about Penn State Extension, for example. How can we provide the education? I don't expect farm owners to have all of these ideas of human resource practices in their mind, right? So they already have a lot in their plate. So as an educators here, I'm thinking Penn State Extension may have the opportunity, how do we train them? How can we provide the proper training for basic human resource practice, like increasing the frequency of communication, conducting an annual performance review, providing financial incentives? I think it requires some of training here.
That's an interesting point on human resources. I didn't talk about that much on the slide that showed up in my presentation, but not many, at least based on our survey, not many people had any human resources training, which based on the size of the dairies makes sense. I mean, if you're milking 50 or 60 cows and you don't really have any employees, it doesn't make any sense for human resources training if you think of it that way. But I mean, also that 50 cow dairy probably has a child, and I know I instruct my children different than I did my employees when I was more patient with my employees and everything, and so even if a dairy farm doesn't have any employees, then human resources training even will help with those family relationships, and so that's a good point.
And Zach, I actually did the analysis classifying large versus small farmers, right? Going to your point, maybe small farmers are in less need of human resource practices training. I would say that even if I would say remove them from the sample, still there are a high percentage of large farmers who do not practice this basic HR practices. So it is still, I would say, a huge opportunity for the dairy industry to work to address this issue of the lack of basic human resource practices.
All right, thank you. Well, we did have two questions come in. I'll remind you, if you do want to ask a question and you want to ask it verbally, if you want to raise your hand, and then we'll recognize you and you can unmute yourself and ask, that's fine too. And that now that we're not presenting, if you want to verbally ask a question, that's fine. But we'll go ahead and address the two questions that came in through the chat. If not participating in farm, where they asked about participation in other similar programs. So in our survey, we only asked about the farm program. So it very well could be that 20% of those that said they didn't participate in farm, maybe they were involved in another. There are several programs out there. I know some processors have their own programs, but we just asked about the one national program, the farm program, and so we don't really have any way to say, well, those that don't participate in farm participate in something else. I don't know if you want to add anything, Veronica, to that or not.
No.
Okay. So there's the next question that came in is, for those dairies that were no longer in business, were those dairies taken over by another dairy, either for milk production or additional land base? So again, the survey didn't address that question. So all we know is they went out of business. We don't know if they were taken over or what. So that was beyond the scope of our survey. So again, that's the two questions we've had in the chat. I do have a couple of questions here that we can go through that we came up with on our own to maybe give everyone a chance to think about some other questions. But please, if you have any questions, we're at 1:05 and we have time slotted to 1:30, so we have plenty of time to answer your questions. Or if you want to see another one of our slides or something, we can we can pull that up and go into some of the information a little more thoroughly, perhaps. So, just a couple of questions here, and I guess maybe this one is one that I'll cover, Veronica. On the heifer to cow ratio, how does that compare to PSU recommendations? On the number of heifers per cows in a herd, again, the old standard was 1 heifer to every 1 cow, but that doesn't seem to be the case in these herds. Are there any trends that might point to in our state's dairy herd? Well, I sort of covered that in my presentation, that the old rule of thumb is 1 heifer for every cow, but based on market conditions today and the cost of raising a heifer, and we have farm practices like gender selected semen, where we can increase the likelihood of having more heifer calves. So what is the magic number of heifers to have? I guess the short answer is it depends. It depends. A lot of that, there are ways to calculate that. I know Dr. Judd Heinrichs with Penn State was on our dairy summit here a couple of weeks ago and gave a presentation, or last week gave a presentation on the cost of raising heifers. And so there's certainly resources there to help you determine what that number is for you, but it depends on, of course, it depends on your cost of raising a heifer, and it depends on your cull rate. How often are you culling cows out of your herd and that you need a replacement for, and the number of heifers that are born on your dairy farm. So that number can be calculated, and it's going to be slightly different based on those factors from dairy to dairy. But I would certainly say that having 1 heifer per cow, unless you're trying to expand internally, you don't need that many heifers, and it represents perhaps you're losing money by keeping more heifers than you need, because extra heifers, if you replace an older profitable cow with a younger heifer that hadn't covered her cost of production of raising her yet, then that represents a loss of revenue to you. And if you don't want to be overcrowded, don't want to expand, it probably, at this point in time, it probably costs more to raise that heifer to the age of a Springer than what the value is that you'll get if you try to sell her as a Springer. So I would encourage you to work with some of your consultants and figuring out how many heifers you need and what that number of heifers is for your operation to be the most profitable. I don't know if you have any input, Veronica. Or... Another question, no other questions have come in yet, and I'm assuming there hasn't been anything to come through Facebook or YouTube yet. So we'll go down the line here. It's surprising that only 54% of farms rated CFAP as important. Why do you think that is? Well, as I mentioned during the study, that was at the time only the first round of CFAP was available, and things hadn't progressed as far as, of course, we know that it has now. Hindsight's 2020. So given that first round of payments, we didn't know that it was going to get perhaps as bad as it did get. And of course, there was a second round of CFAP payments, as I mentioned in my presentation. The Pennsylvania Department of Ag and the governor put together a program to try to reimburse dairy farmers for dumped milk or fees charged associated with dumping that milk. And so I would imagine that if we asked that question today, that we would probably get a lot higher percent to say that yes, it was important, because those CFAP payments, along with some of the other risk management tools that people did participate in, made a significant difference for the viability of, at least in my opinion, provided a lot of needed income last year to dairy farmers. So again, we had one that came in. Let's see. Regarding the study that concludes farmers who invest in environmental practices are more likely to remain in business. So Veronica, this one will be for you. Wouldn't you assume it's it's the opposite that's true. The more likely farmers are to remain in business, the more likely they would be to invest in environmental practices.
Great. This is Carissa. Yes, Carissa, we always have, when we conduct this kind of analysis, there is always the option to have reverse causality, which is what you're saying here. A couple of things. First, in the survey, we asked the farmers that what are the investments that they did from 2015 to 2020. So we asked the farmers the investments prior, the COVID-19 pandemic, whether they will continue or not in business. So we consider the time lag, for here are the investments 5 years before, whether they are going to continue or not in business. The second thing that is to keep in mind is that we try, to complement the statistical analysis with some qualitative analysis. In fact, I interviewed 10 Pennsylvania farmers. I know some of you are here. And they were telling me all the benefits of after implementing a conservation practice or environmental practices. Benefits like, I have better yield, Veronica. After doing X, I actually have, better healthy soil, better yield. I save money. I use less manpower to do this as before. So I would say it's not what the statistics analysis are telling us, although they are, we try to cover the fact that there is a time lag between conservation practices and the likelihood of stay on business, but also is kind of the insights from the farmers telling us that, for example, implementing some of the basic HR practices, their farm workers are going to be more productive. They are going to go, they're going to be very reliable. They're going to show up every day to their farms. And that increases the productivity of the farms, right? So really, it has an impact on the bottom line. I will say, again, this is coming from the statistical analysis and also complemented with the qualitative insights from the farmers that I interviewed.
Okay, I started talking, realized I was still on mute, but I have another question here, Veronica, that's for you, and it's again related to communication. You documented how likely and how often farm managers communicated with their employees. Did that correlate with any performance indicators? For example, did farms that communicate more often tend to have higher milk production per cow or anything like that?
This is an excellent question, and I haven't run that analysis, but I'm certainly taking notes here. So what we did only was correlating this with, the likelihood to stay in business and the likelihood of implementing an emergency plan. We haven't looked at, I have not done the analysis yet, whether, have, let's say, better production, milk production.
Okay, thanks. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah.
So I've got another one here on somatic cell counts. So that'll be for me. What was the average somatic cell count across the herd surveyed, and how does that compare to the average somatic cell count for the state? So the way we designed that somatic cell count question, it was a range. They were to indicate a range of where their somatic cell count fell. So there wasn't really a way to calculate an average, but I will. The state average, at least based on December DHIA numbers, was like 100, and I want to say it was 182,000 or 189,000. I don't remember off the top of my head. And I would think that would correlate if you remember the distribution. Most of those dairies, the largest portion of dairies answered that their somatic cell count fell in the range of, if I remember right, between 100 and 250 cows. So the middle two, or 250,000 somatic cell count. So that middle dairies and that 189 or whatever it is for December would fall within that range. So I would say that it's pretty, at least the range indicated by the survey results is within the average for the state. Any more questions? Please, if you have any questions, we do have 15 more minutes. And if there are any other questions, please chat them in the box or unmute yourself and ask. We'll be glad to try to answer those. And I don't.
Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
My question is on risk management. With costs going up, feed, labor, fuel, everything, even though we know our cost of production in the last year or 2 years is changing drastically, and there's the only risk management practice out there to cover the cost of production is the milk price for the 5 million pounds. Everything else is based on price, and it's awful hard to do risk management right now that covers your cost.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With the volatility, of course, I mean, the point of risk management is to mitigate. I mean, that doesn't, as you well know, that doesn't mean you're always going to come out ahead, but you're going to, hopefully, if you've done it right, if you do have a loss, you're going to mitigate that loss, and it won't be as severe as if you didn't have that risk management plan. But you're right. The dairy margin coverage, tier 1 dairy margin coverage is at least for 2021, if you enrolled, is the most cost. It was the cheapest option that created the highest floor. But of course, if you're over 5 million pounds of production, if you're well over that, it only covers just a small portion of your milk production. And although there's other programs like dairy revenue protection, volatility is, of course, causing those premium costs to be more expensive. But at least right now, if you're willing to spend the money on some of those policies, it sets a pretty decent a floor. But like I said, it's pricey and maybe isn't be too expensive to tie up a large portion of your milk using those programs. But again, I agree, it's difficult with the volatility going on to make sure you've covered your cost of production. But again, the other point is if you do have to take a loss, you're mitigating that loss, so it's not as substantial. So even though it's difficult, it's still recommended to have a risk management plan and consistently use it. Don't use it 1 year and decide you don't want to use it the next. So it's an ongoing process.
What is if anything is being done to take care of the difference between class 3 and class 4 prices, which in July and in November, anyone who had class 3 milk contracted really took it. I mean, and didn't get, normally when you lose money in a contract, it comes back in your milk check, or part of it does, and very little of that did. And that I know I had, and I know some other people did, had considerable milk in class 3 contracts in July, excuse me, in November. And normally that would not have been a problem, but it sure was this year.
Absolutely. I understand where you're coming from. And of course, that problem, excuse me, that problem came from the class 1 price change back in May of 2019. And when that difference between class 3 and class 4 gets over $1.48 a hundredweight, it really, well, the negative PPDs come into play and can wreak havoc on your milk check. But I lost my train of thought. Sorry, John.
It's not as, it is PPD, but the PPD, all that is the difference between your net price and your class 3 price. So class 3 is the one that screwed it up. So what I'm asking is, are we going back to our old formula? Or the other thing we could have did to help some was, if we're going to average class 1 to 3 and 4, then we should have averaged class 2 to 3 and 4, which would have helped.
Yeah. Well, those I remember sort of the train I was taking. Those changes, of course, have to be made on the federal level, and I do know that National Milk and other national groups, I think IDFA is another one on the processor side, that are recommending to legislators and are lobbying for federal milk marketing and order change that would address that class 1 milk price change, and hopefully, if that is allowed to proceed and through whatever process it is, whether it's legislatively or through the normal USDA hearing price, hopefully time will be given for a better solution to be developed. And once potential solutions are proposed, and hopefully there'll be enough time given to vet those to make sure we don't have a situation that happened like what happened when they made the class 1 change back in May of 2019. So that was a change that was made, I know, with the best intentions to help the whole industry out, but really over, 2020 and continuing now, it's that class 1 change is really messing dairy farmers up. I know Matt Gould did an analysis that if we were still using the higher of class 3 and class 4, that milk price would have been a full $1 per hundredweight more since May of 2019 compared to what it's currently been. So yeah, there certainly needs to be something done, but unfortunately it's going to be a slow process, but we don't want to rush it too quickly, because then we may, in another year, we may be sitting in the same place where we are now with additional unintended consequences. I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but unfortunately it's sort of the best I can do right now. Is there any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat, and I'm not hearing anybody unmute themselves. So we'll go ahead and end the program today. Before we do that, I would like to thank Veronica again for her participation in the survey and her presentation today. And I'd also like to thank the participants that completed and sent in their survey. Again, I know it was 27 questions with multiple parts on those questions. It was probably somewhat time consuming, but we certainly appreciate you taking the time to fill out that information and send back in to us. And I'd put in the chat earlier that if you're interested in the full report that I wrote up on the 2020 dairy survey that is posted on our webpage, I put that in the chat. Or if you go to to centerfordairyexcellence.org, and click on the menu, and then the center, it's under PA Dairy Goodness That Matters menu. You can find a link to that report there. And it's also, if you go to that centerfordairyexcellence.org, it's listed under the latest news and featured articles with a direct link to that as well. So if you're interested in that report, and of course there's quite a bit more detail in the report, more graphs and stuff to look at than what we had time to present today. And Emily put in the chat, Emily put the link in there again. So if you want to click on that before we end, it'll take you to that page, and then you can bookmark it if you want to. But again, thank you very much for joining us today. I was pleased with the participation we had today, and this was recorded, and so we'll be sending out the recording link as soon as it's available. And also, of course, once we end, it'll still be available on either YouTube or Facebook on the Center for Dairy Excellence's pages there. So with that, thank you again. And again, if any of the co-ops or milk marketers that want their specific information, certainly contact me, and I'll be glad to provide that information to you on your co-op, and so where you can compare that against the total average. So again, thank you, and we look forward to our next event. So with that, hope everyone has a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.